questions that I was one or two of them. I'm fascinated with it. I'm interested, you talked about the cycle, you have to go on a 30-year cycle. Build it so that it will operate at 30 years.
Right.
Are you talking about building something that will then be reconstructed after 30 years? Are you talking about constant reconstructions over those 30 years?
But you saw several examples of different approaches. But in China, and also we've done this in Hawaii through a big aquaculture facility, we use the same materials that are used in the mostly in the Scandinavian offshore salmon farming industry, and that's where we get our materials, and they have a pretty good track record. The Tyson Foods got into a fight with the state of Maryland and left, and the restorer is still sitting there. It doesn't want to go away. It's still working away. Down in Berlin, Maryland owns it. They don't know what to do.
Another thing has to do with reliability. Taking nutrients which are coming from the land.
Yeah.
They're coming downstream from the land. They're going to continue to come no matter what. So you've got to be sure you keep on operating the system reliably over the whole period. What about storms and other reasons for the system like crash?
Well, the mooring systems for these offshore things are pretty remarkable and pretty robust. You rarely hear, although I'm not saying it isn't happening, a sea farm, salmon farm in the North Atlantic busting up. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. I just haven't. But in here in these bays, and since it's not all one system, it would be separate systems, just because you want to be able to have access to circulate the water in the various bays.
One more question about it. Would you be planning to try to catch as much of the nutrients in the system as you can, where the nutrients are heaviest up the rivers?
Yeah.
Not in the bay itself so much as up the rivers, so you catch the nutrients before they get.
Well, that was what the whole plan around the Santuit was to do. And I think it's here, there are 4 streams here, and one of them is in fairly bad shape, and the others are being restored now.
Well, in terms of the freshwater ecology is being restored between the Childs and the Quashnet, but as soon as they hit the salt water, the nitrogen levels are off the charts, and it's really nutrified. And the Quashnet turns into the Moonicus.
Yeah.
The Moonicus is really in bad shape, and the lower part of the Childs River is in equally bad shape. So there's, all the indicators are that it's quickly losing all life.
I just want to say something, that we have to look at the financing of this maybe in a totally new light. I think Pearson was talking about the idea of cooperative. If you look into the laws of cooperatives, there's lots of opportunities, a lot to fund it. Also, I think it's going to take 1 or 2 of these projects in the first place. It may need private, independent funding, realizing that from the point of view of the regulatory community or the political community, it's too risky. So I set out a couple of years ago to try and this is sort of looking all around the world, to raise the money so we could underwrite a couple projects like this, and then we could figure out how that money gets paid back over time, but to get going. And we're fairly optimistic that this might be successful. It's 2.5 years of hard work. But I'm kind of anxious because, you know, I'm no longer 37.
So,
We have 2 questions that came in pretty back to back in the chat. So I'm going to do the first one. And then after that, we'll have the second question from the chat there. I'd also like to remind our speakers that the microphone is right here.
Okay.
Our first question is from Timothy Martin. And he says, to what extent are these structures storm resistant? Also, what amount of harvesting of biomass is required and how can that harvest be utilized?
I think he's just tapped into our discussion that we've just kind of had.
Yeah, he asked a few minutes ago, so.
One part about the, robustness or storms, and they're not systems that are heavily reliant on mechanical process. And the infrastructure is much more passive. It's not completely passive, but it's much more passive. So in the event of something that's predicted, there's ways to remove sensitive things. But in a large part, what it's doing is putting back what was here before large development. And so it's putting back ecosystems and seeding the environment with biology and different processes that were going on in the marine environment that aren't, or were going on in estuaries or rivers, in lakes that aren't happening because of anthropogenic sources of pressure, for lack of a better term, whether it be pollutants or removal, change of wetlands to houses. All of these natural systems were doing work that isn't calculable within the economies. And that's some of the pressure that Cape Cod that we're dealing with. I live in Martians Mills, and the lake down the street from my house, you can't swim in anymore because of cyanobacteria. At a certain point, it's going to have an economic. So that's the other side of all this stuff. At a certain point, we're going to reach a different point.
Just walk around with this.
they're having trouble hearing people, so I'm going to walk around with this. Joan, you have a question? Can you
No,
walk?
wait, we've got one more question.
Okay.
This is from Carol. And Carol says, what's the smallest scale at which such systems are viable in cleaning water? And does it matter if they're fresh or salt water?
The household is the smallest you can go. Although some of my students at the University of Vermont think you can go even smaller than that, but that's, the trouble is when you get tiny systems, they require people who understand them to manage them because there's not enough biodiversity and sites for exchange of information or nutrients or what have you. So small is not easy, but small can be done.
There's nothing wrong with small.
And there's nothing wrong with small.
Small is beautiful. Joan, why don't you come up? So can you take your mask off because people just can't hear you. Sorry.
Once you get this installed, how much does it run by itself? How much maintenance or how much intervention by people does it need once it gets started?
What are the maintenance costs?
Yeah, oh, I've got those numbers somewhere. Not in my head tonight.
But the 3 million a year accounts for that.
Yes, it's, I'm trying to think the number. Anyway, there are, these facilities are producing things people want as well. So that we're hoping to, as much of the operations, to have an internal financing for it.
Do you want to?
On top of that, like, after John showed the slides of South Burlington region, after that was decommissioned in terms of its project, and being run, and the inlet of water got cut off from that. 5 years later, the life forms were still in the system. The system itself was still growing. A bald cypress grew through the top of the greenhouse and survived in Burlington, Vermont in winter. So that, just like the wetlands die back in the winter and come back, those elements of the system progress.
Maggie, do you have a question?
So my question, this is just such a astonishing vision. I would love to have a sense of what we would see if we turned around and we looked at Walkway Bay after these restorers were in place.
It doesn't look. Well, because they're so close to the surface water, there's not big stuff up in the air. So what you would basically see is something that from a distance would look like a floating marsh.
Like a floating garden or something like that.
Floating marsh.
Yeah.
And how would this be a number of different floating marshes in different locations across the bay, or would it likely be?
If you look at that photograph that I showed, there are bays within the bay, and each one, depending on the water circulation, I'm sure that people here know so much about the water circulation. But if a body of water is more or less isolated from the others, that would need its own system.
Like a Moonicus,
Like a Moonicus,
right,
yes.
which is terrible, just terrible.
We have another one. The chat, this is from Hilda Mayday, and she asks, how many pounds of plant materials have to be removed for every pound of nitrogen removed?
A new alchemy,
Well, yeah. As a general rule, we try and plant beneficial plants as much as possible so that there is an incentive to crop these systems. And for example, in China, we did a lot of work with the Chinese medical herbs. And but I also have to confess, nobody was looking at what was getting into the vegetation. That was not part of the program.
Can you ever find out you use invasives in order to get?
you want to say that again, Wayne? Because people can't hear you.
Do you ever find that you have to use invasive species in an area in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish?
You saw that slide I showed it from the river with the purple moose stripe.
Yes.
From the very first system we built on Flax Pond in Harwich, who showed up for breakfast on the second day was the purple moose stripe.
No.
Yeah. So obviously they have some ability to do something that sort of supports these systems. They were not invading around. So I don't understand it really.
But you don't have to build in invasive species in order to make the thing work.
No. No, in fact,
That would provide a regulatory problem.
no, that would be it. Somehow they've never been invaded by Phragmites or Japanese knotweed. It's that purple loosestrife that just loves a floating island.
James, you had a question? Oh, something to mention tonight is the northern part, I guess it's more than, a little less than a third of this bay has been cut off to shellfishing. You can't shellfish. It's a huge,
That would
gigantic
be
area.
Ideal site to
That's what I'm thinking.
turn
you
it
know.
around.
We've discussed, I don't know if I'm, we've discussed isolating a part of the bay like they did in Cape Cod Bay. And they turned it into a reserve. So there was no fishing, there was nothing, in it. They just let it grow.
Yeah.
And now the fishermen, the commercial ship fishermen and the recreational fishermen love to fish around that. I think it was Studs, Congressman Studs legislation, and they created that area where nothing could happen. There could be no draggers, no fishing, nothing. And it's become a real wildlife refuge underwater. So the discussion was, what would happen if we did that here in Wacoit Bay? And you got to imagine that it would be similar to what happened in Cape Cod Bay.
There are a lot more claims in this year.
Yeah, but you can fish for them, but the rest of the northern part of the bay is off limits. Any other questions?
Where do we start?
It's, well, like Dr. Todd was saying, there are a number of ways to do this. If we could get everybody in the watershed to form a cooperative and agree to taxing themselves, it would be a way to, we could do it ourselves. We wouldn't have to wait for the town.
How does that work? How does that?
It would be a vote of several votes over, a period of probably a couple of years to make it work, and it wouldn't be easy. But as I mentioned earlier, we're the last ones. Wacoit Bay is the last bay moving eastward for the town in their plans to sewer. Now, they were hoping for alternatives to show up. I would say that this is an alternative that should be considered. Not that we wouldn't sewer in the future, but in 20, 30 years, why should we let this go to hell over 20 or 30 years? Why don't we spend the money to create the eco machines that will clean it in the interim, and then have our septic systems, addressed, or whatever other methods come along. When
It's ironic that both of us joined the water quality management committee in Falmouth because there was a plan in place to develop alternatives to sewer. But Floating Island was not on that list of alternatives.
it wasn't even considered, yeah.
Wasn't even considered at that time. Well, how nice it would have been if there had been on that, one of those, because they were funding alternatives in small scale to see what would work at that time. Funded eco toilets, they funded work on oysters, they funded work on ERDs, they funded a number of other things, alternatives to sewer. And some of them have turned out to be things that have a place in the plan in the future, like oysters, for example.
Oysters and permeable reactive barriers.
And permeable reactive barriers. Right. So it's ironic that we didn't start then. Maybe we'd be farther along somewhere.
So you got a question?
We have another question from the Zoom chat from Alexandra Lancaster. Alexandra wants to know, what bay is so shallow? Would the system be able to be installed?
Hello, Alexander. Alex,
Alexandra.
member. Alexandra. So her question, did you?
Yeah, I think that, I only know that Santuit Pond, which is maximum depth of 11 feet in the slots. I
It's,
imagine at low tide here, there's quite a bit of the bay that's deeper than 6 feet.
you can shellfish. I mean, I can get out of my boat and shellfish in the middle of it, with the water at low tide, probably up to my hips.
The maximum depth of Walkway Bay right off here is in this part is 12 feet or so. If it's still 12 feet, it might have filled in a couple of feet in the last 50 years. And down the bay, the maximum depth all over the place is 3 or 4 or 5 feet, something like that. That works.
Yeah.
And the channel
In
is,
fact, it hasn't happened yet, but it can even dry out at low tide and just sit there.
Oh, the eco machine.
how much depth does an eco machine require?
Some of them are pretty shallow. That canal, Fujo, is only 4 or 5 feet deep.
Maggie, you had another question?
I did, but I think we should answer.
Okay.
Oh, I guess it was, no.
No. Okay. Hey, thank you very much. I think this has been,
Listening to me, maybe, I tell you what, you drive a getaway car, I'll go into the bank. Maybe between the two of us.
well, with this new infrastructure bill getting passed, let's hope that happens. Maybe that's something we could.
But you could tell John's lived in Montreal with a really good
I think another thing that can be said is a smaller demonstration has to be made. And you could probably, if strategically placed, I would be surprised if you couldn't.
The Moonicus would be perfect. I think.
Yeah, yeah, we should take a look at it.
Yeah, I think, the amount of area is part of that you're trying to work with is part of the calculation and size.
Sure.
And if there's like a strategic outfall, you can design around it. None of these things are issues, whether it be depth or the size or storms. They're not issues that stop something. They're just elements that have to be incorporated in design. And built around that.
You can tell Pearson's an engineer. I can see him thinking.
Would it just be pulled in for the winter? Or would
No.
you greenhouse it?
I wouldn't think so.
I don't think so, no. I think if you have, it all depends on where it is, but I don't think you would need to.
Yeah, we 1 year on Flax Pond, we had a restore on Flax Pond for 9 years and brought it pond back to life. We shut it down in the winter because it was fresh water and we wanted the ice to freeze around the system so kids wouldn't go out and drown. So they had to just stop it so that they weren't taking the upwelling water from the bottom and constantly thawing the ice with the warmer water from the bottom. So we had to do that.
There hasn't been any ice skating on Quake Bay for quite a while. But,
There's up the river.
yeah, up the river, in the
I
fresh
bet there
water.
must be some pretty fancy ice boat at one point.
Anything else and anything anybody wants to say? I'll close by saying, I can't see myself. I'll close by saying thank you all for coming tonight. it's a very interesting concept. I think it has promise. If we could do a smaller version of it up one of these rivers, you know, the freshwater rivers that turn into saltwater estuaries that are really in tough shape, heavy loads of nitrogen. Literally, it's really hard to find benthic invertebrates in the sediments that they used to find, or that you find in healthy basin. No eelgrass. If we let this continue as it is, it's going to die pretty badly. And for some of you who lived here when we had the fish kills, after a rainstorm, from heavy rain, the rainstorms are much worse now because of global warming. We get much more intense rains. It prevents and then we get cloudy days on top of that. That prevents the oxygenation of the water, and we get these major fish kills. We had about 2 or 3 of them back in 2000, in the 2000 or early 2000s. So to me, this could be an opportunity. Maybe we could, as an organization, get behind it and see if we can come up with some fun mechanism to make this happen. So thank you for attending, and thank everybody online. We had 35 people on Zoom, and I appreciate it.